Hello everyone, I'm I.R.O. Today I have something special for you guys to celebrate my 20 subscribers and 13 Instagram followers. So to show appreciation to those wonderful people, I decided to tackle this massive project. This video will show you guys how I painted Katakros for Ozark Bone Reaper's army, and mostly just using paintbrushes. So if you are interested to know how I did, stay tuned. But without further ado, let's get to it. The first thing I do is open the box to take out the content, which includes sprues and a thorough instruction booklet of how to build the model. The instruction also included a recommended paint recipe used to paint the model like the box art, which I'll be referencing when I paint the model. Then I prepare my tools to build the model. The specifics will be listed in the video description below. I cut out the sprues, glued them, sand them, and cleaned it up with a dish soap and water. When it was dried, I sprayed the model using Chaos Black as my primer, which we'll see the result shortly. Since this video's main focus is the painting progress, I cut out the building footage, so apologies if anyone was interested. As you can see here, the models are assembled in sub-assemblies, which would allow me to reach into areas that would normally be difficult to paint. My plan was to paint each figure individually to practice before I painted the centerpiece model, which will be Katakros. Therefore, I started out with the scroll bearer. Before I painted the model, I wanted to show you guys something neat. You have to shake Citadel paint pots to get a nice paint consistency. However, many people will know that paints get dried on the lid, usually clogging the lid and drying up the paints quicker. So what I do is get a paint mixer, thoroughly mix the paint inside. Not only is this a neat way to do it, but also helps mix the paint that tends to be heavily clogged. With the paint ready to be used, I dabbed some into the palette, mixed with tiny amount of water to thin it down, and started painting. Morgan's bone was used as a base coat for the body. Notice the first coat doesn't cover the body nicely, but that's okay. Once the paint is dry, I will be applying a second coat, and possibly a third coat depending on the finish to get a nice base coat. We have a beautifully detailed and sculpted, but also very expensive model. So to make sure we don't clog these details, painting in thin layers helps greatly. So take your time and make sure to let the paint dry thoroughly before you apply another layer. Just as an example, this is what it looks like when you apply the second coat. Notice it has nicer coverage than the first. Apply the third coat since I still saw some black undercoat beneath, but if you guys aren't bothered, then a second coat is just enough. The base coat is finally done, and now we can go on to the next step, which is shading. I used Aakash Earthshade and applied it all over the model. I made sure to thoroughly cover the miniature in the first coat, but also make sure to remove any pooling by soaking the excess with a clean brush. Once I applied the shade, I let it dry for 30 minutes. 30 minutes later, the shade dried nicely and it gave a nice depth to the miniature. The next step, I used Screaming Skull and dry brushed it all over the model. After the dry brush, I used Screaming Skull again, but this time I applied it as a layer. Since the model had lots of bumps and details, it would be difficult to spot the raised surfaces. So I used dry brushing to visually analyze where to paint my layers to make sure I don't paint over shadows and recesses. Also, I make sure to paint this layer in 2 thin layers. Using white scar now, I paint edges and areas that are most prominent on the model. With all that done, the body is now completed, and now I focused on other parts of the model such as the scrolls, straps, and other details. The scrolls were base coated in rock hard flesh. When the base was ready, it was then shaded in Seraphim Sepia and dry brushed with Screaming Skull once the shade was dry. To give that rough paper texture, I initially didn't apply a layer to the scroll. Then I used white scar as a dry brush on the most prominent area and the scrolls were finished. Next up, I base coated most of the details to shade them all at the same time. So first I painted the clothes in the Incubi Darkness. Morphing Brown was used in leather areas. Mephiston Red was applied to straps. And Abaddon Black on the neck string. With all that details base coated, I used Nolan Oil to carefully shade the areas I base coated while avoiding the scrolls and the body that were finished. Of course, with shades we have to wait until it's thoroughly dried. With the shade dried, I used Incubi Darkness to apply a highlight on the cloth, while leaving the deepest recesses as shadows. Then, this was completely unnecessary, but I mixed Lamia Medium with Cav-Light Green and applied the mixture as a heavy glaze highlight to the cloth. I noticed this method was unnecessary since I could have just dry brushed Cav-Light Green on the model, and then highlighted again with the same color to get a nice blend. But here I am wasting a little bit of time, so enjoy. Scarsnick green was used as a fine highlight on most prominent areas. I noticed the blending on highlight was rough, so I mixed Lamia medium with Incubi darkness and applied a glaze over the cloth to smoothen out the transition. Then I went over with Scarsnick's green again for my highlight. Although my method was a little excessive, I still like how the cloth came out. Next, Deathclaw brown was dry brushed into the brown leather. Then without cleaning the brush, I grabbed Screaming Skull, rubbed the excess off with the tissue, and dry brushed the highlight. Onto the red areas now. Wazdaka Red was used as the first edge highlight, and Tuscarora Fur was used as a fine edge highlight. Onto the black areas, Mechanicus Standard Grey as the first edge highlight, followed by Administratum Grey as the fine highlight. At this point, all I needed to do was paint the metal areas, which was base coated with Balthazar Gold, shaded with Reikland Flesh Shade Gloss, highlighted with Hushnet Copper, and finally edge highlighted with Stormhold Silver. With everything done, we have our first model ready. The method and paint recipes you saw in the first model can be used on all other models. However, for the purpose of this tutorial, I won't repeat the steps, but instead show you guys something that hasn't been shown yet. With that said, let's paint the next model, which is the Spine Master. Similar to the Scroll Bearer, Morgath's Bone was used as a base coat for the body. Instead of Aakash Earthshade to shade the model, however, Nolan Oil was used to shade the model. After this, I did the same thing where I dry brushed the body with Screaming Skull, painted highlight with Screaming Skull, and the fine highlight with White Scar. I noticed in the box art there were some areas on the body that had a darker shade blended in, so I used Aakash Earthshade to paint the darker shade to those areas and applied it in 2 coats. After the paint was dry, I repainted the highlights with White Scar. Next, Korax White was used as a base coat to several details such as the bird in the cage, bird carried on the hand, leather straps, bone decoration, and other areas which I used the box art for reference. I highly recommend looking at the reference if you are also unsure to where to paint. With a white base coat applied, next was applying shades. For birds, I used Apothecary White as my shade. Apothecary White is a contrast paint, but it is very nice as a shade for white since it doesn't darken the color too much. While Apothecary White was drying, I used Nolan Oil on the bone decorations. Voluptuous Pink on the leather straps. When Apothecary White was nicely dried, Magos Purple was painted onto the head area for the birds. This was done taking reference from the box art. After that, Shyish Purple was applied onto the glass bottle hanging from the hip. Snakebite Leather on the cork cap. With all the shades nicely dried, I can finally apply some highlights. To the white areas, Ulthorn Grey was dry brushed on as a highlight. The pink strap, Screaming Skull was dry brushed gently as a highlight. Going back to the white bone areas, Ulthorn Grey was used as a layer highlight on raised areas, leaving the shadows alone. Then White Scar was used as a fine highlight. Most of the other details you see on this model use the steps done for the Scroll Bearer, but the armor hasn't been done yet, so I will demonstrate. Cantor Blue was used as a base coat to the armor areas and also to the candle. Once the base coat was ready, Nolan Oil was used as a shade. Next, a mix of Lamia Medium and Rust Grey was used to paint the highlights on the blue areas. I applied this highlight to get a nice blending highlight so that when I applied the next highlight, the transition wouldn't look too rough. My next highlight was using Rust Grey, again but without mixing Lamia Medium. Finally, Blue Horror was used as a fine edge highlight to the blue areas. After the blue area was done, I did all the other areas that were done similar to the Scroll Bearer. All that is left are the tiny details such as the eyes, flames, crow's head, and a few more. Korax White was used as a base coat on the candle, crow's head, and feet. Skeleton Horde was used to paint the skull of the crow and the tiny paper scrolls on the bird. Once those paints were dried, I used Eoden Yellow on the yellow beaks and feet of the crow, and Black Templar on the strings for the tiny scroll. Lamentus Yellow Glaze was applied onto the candle flame and the eyes. Then White Watcher Green was applied when the previous paint was dry. For the candle area, I used Scarsnick Green, Cabalite Green, Incubi Darkness, and then Abaddon Black, each painted in smaller area to the previous paint to give the effect of a candle burning. To further sell the effect of fire effect, I used White Scar to paint the tiny dots on the flame, and small fine highlights near the rim for light reflection. With all that done, the Spy Master is done. The next model I painted was the Prime Necropolis, and most of the steps done to paint this model was already demonstrated in the two previous models. However, after I painted this model, I realized there were some parts that needed to be explained, so I decided to use the Leech Mortis model to demonstrate the new steps. Unlike other models, Leech Mortis has a black bone armor, so I started off by painting the body with Abaddon Black as my base coat. With the base coat applied, I heavily dry brushed Skaven Blight Dinge and then lightly dry brushed the lighter tone of Storm Vermin Fur. Thanks to the dry brushing, I got a clear sketch of where to paint my highlights, which I used Storm Vermin Fur again to highlight. Then, Administratum Grey was used to highlight the most prominent details on the body. While I was painting the model, I also applied highlight to the black gem and painted a dot of white scar at the tip. With all that done, I proceeded to base coat other parts on the model, and here you can see me base coating the cloak with Khorne Red. There was a fleshy tone to the sheath, and following the picture and instruction, I painted this part with Rockhearth Flesh. With all the base coat applied to the model, I proceeded to shade all those areas except the sheath with Nuln Oil. I switched back and forth between different sizes of brush to make sure those shades won't spill over to areas that I don't want to. With Nuln Oil applied, I used different shades, Raglan Flesh Shade to shade the middle body of the sheath, and Magos Purple on the ends and blade guard to give that pinkish flesh tone. I don't really know what you call this part, but the towel wrapped around his stomach was painted with mixed 3:1 of Lamia Medium and Nihon Gloom. You can use Nihon Gloom alone, but it tends to shade too strongly, and I wanted to get that light tinted shade as if the towel was ethereal. With all the shades dried, I began highlighting those details in which most of them were already shown in the previous step. But for the cloak, I touched up with Khorne Red again, leaving the recess alone. Then Tusgore Fur was used as a highlight, which was painted in thick line on the raised area on the cloak. Finally, Carrick Stone was used as a fine highlight. This is what the cloak looks like when it was all done. For the sheath, I painted a highlight of Screaming Skull on edges and raised areas. And once that was done, Pallid Witch Flesh as my extreme highlight. For the towel, Ulthorn Grey was used as a highlight. Then the rest of the details such as the bone decorations, blue armor, and etc. were done using the steps done previously. Also, I forgot to take a photo or recording of the completed Legion Mortis. Sorry. Before I painted up Katakros, I decided to leave the best one for last and worked on the base, but also because I will be applying texture paint which requires a long drying time. Dryer bark was used to base coat the base entirely. Vandry dust was used to base coat the bone decorations on the base. This is considered a highlight, but I base coated Screaming Skull to the bone decoration. Then Carrick Stone was used to base coat the flooring. I painted Mechanica Standard Grey on the dirt looking thing. With all those base coats applied, it was time to apply the texture paint, which I used Astrogranite and Astrogranite debris with a Citadel spatula. You can just use one of the texture paints alone, but I used both to get an interesting and varying texture on the base. FYI, you can use a brush to apply this texture paint, but it will horribly ruin the brush. So if you do, use an old one or cheap one if possible. Also make sure to clean up the rim if any texture gets spilled over. I waited several hours for the texture paint to fully cure, which allowed me to proceed with shading. For the flooring and broken pillars, I used Wrinkling Flesh Shade. Agrax Earth Shade on the bone details. Finally, Nuln Oil on the rest of the model, including the textured base. With all the shades applied, I waited until they dried. Once that was done, another dry brush with Administratum Gray. It's okay if you got some of the Administratum Gray on the model, because I was imagining that dust and dirt will settle on these areas, so you can be liberal with this dry brushing, but don't go too much. Next up was painting the treasures on the base, which was base coated with Balthazar Gold, and then shaded with Agrax Earth Shade. When the shade was dry, I dry brushed Stormwell Silver carefully to those gold decorations. With that done, I painted the rim of the base with Abaddon Black, and using Citadel's Midland Tufts, I decorated the base. With that, the base is complete, and finally, Katakros is next. Body armor of Katakros was base coated with Ionarch skin. I diverge a little from the instruction here since I didn't have the paint available, but I prepare a shade mixed 3-to-1 with Lamia Medium and Nighthawk Gloom. Then I applied this shade all over the model, made sure to let the paint go in every nook and cranny, but also make sure it doesn't pull over in certain areas, which I used a clean brush to soak up the excess. The reference picture showed there were darker shades in the back wing bone on this model, so I used Nuln Oil and selectively shaded certain areas. When the shade was dry, it was time to dry brush, again which I used Ulthuan Grey to dry brush on my highlight. And yes, this was done to sketch where to paint my layer highlight in the next step. You guys know me too well, I'm quite happy. However, here's the twist. I wanted to get a smoother blended highlight, so for a few layers I painted on Ulthuan Grey mixed with Lamia Medium. Because the highlight is more subtle, when I painted Ulthuan Grey, this time mixed with tiny amount of water as my highlight, the color pops out more and it feels like light is interacting with the body. Finally, white scar was used to highlight the most prominent features on the body. This is what the body looks like right now. Then I proceeded to base coat other details such as the cloak, armor, shield, bone decoration, etc, which I showed how previously. So I've already demonstrated how to paint the green robe already, but I wanted to show you guys a different method. When the Nuln Oil shade was dry on the Incubi Darkness base coat, I heavily dry brushed on Incubi Darkness, but from a certain direction, which would be from the top. Then using Cavalite Green, I dry brushed this color on the robe, but gentler this time. Thanks to the dry brushing, I got a clear sketch on the raised areas, so I used Cavalite Green again to paint the highlight on the robe. Finally, Scarsnick Green was painted on as a fine highlight. Using everything I've shown so far, this is what Katakros looks like. The glowing effect on the runes and eyes were done easily by painting white scar and glazed with Lamentis yellow. The crowd's eyes were glazed with blood letter red. When the paint dried for the eyes, I painted on white scar again and used Waywatcher Green to glaze over the rune and the eyes. The blade and other metal areas were base coated with Iron Warriors. There was one feature I forgot to record, which was painting the wood detail on the back of the shield. This was done by base coating the wood with Clorox White, shaded with Wildwood Contrast, and lightly dry brushed with Ushabti Bone. Using a 50-50 mix of Lamia Medium and Black Templar, I selectively shaded part of the blade such as the body and bottom, which you can see here. The other metal areas were shaded with Agrax Earthshade. To get a darker shade, I applied the second coat of the mix to the blade. Using Iron Warriors, I touched up some areas where I wanted the color to be brighter. In those brighter areas, I painted on Let Belcher and then Iron Breaker as my highlight. I used Nolan Oil as a glaze to blend in the highlight a little. Finally, Stormhold Silver was used to paint the edge highlight on the blade. With all that, we finally have Katakros done. Are you guys ready? Because it's finally time to assemble this fantastic miniature. I used super glue to assemble the models, but I made sure to scrape away the paint on the contact area to allow each piece to firmly stick with each other. Then it was carefully checking each of the pieces would fit and slowly assemble the model. Thank you so much for watching till the end. If you found this demonstration helpful, leave a like, and if you want to see more content and be notified, subscribe to my channel. If you have a suggestion or comment, leave them in the comment section below. Once again, thank you to my subscribers and followers for giving me the motivation to tackle this massive project. This was I.R.O, and thank you for watching.